Welcome everybody to our first suicide prevention webinar. My name is Nate Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Sammamish Community YMCA. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, we're going to have 6 of these webinars available for the community to learn more and have more conversation around suicide prevention and mental health issues. We know that these conversations are extremely important, especially in our current environment. I want to take a moment to give a brief thank you to the Sammamish YMCA Advisory Board and the YMCA of Greater Seattle Social Impact Center, who have collaborated to put these together and present these to you guys over the next several days. Tonight we're going to hear about what causes depression and anxiety from Dr. Albert Tsai, who specializes in psychiatry at Overlake Medical Center and Clinics and is the attending physician at Overlake Adult Day Hospital Program. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Tsai to begin tonight's discussion.
Hi, good evening. My name is Dr. Tsai. I've been a psychiatrist at Overlake since 2012. I run a day hospital program at Overlake Medical Center in Bellevue, and I also have an outpatient panel there. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about what causes depression and anxiety. Go ahead, forward it, Cato, if you wouldn't mind. So the causes of depression and anxiety. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Every healthcare provider nowadays, when they're studying behavioral health, uses the biopsychosocial model of depression and anxiety. And so we're going to be talking about these 3 spheres that influence depression and anxiety. The bio stands for biology. It's represented in blue here. The psychological causes of depression are also going to be talked about, and they will be represented in green. And then the social causes of depression, or the environment, what happens to us, is going to be talked about as well. And so when you think about the biopsychosocial model, you can really take a look at a Venn diagram, these 3 circles. A lot of things go in the biological realm. Some things also go in the psychological realm, as well as the social realm. And the intersection of all 3 of these leads to health or mental health. And it's important to note that all these factors, not just medicines or your biology, not just the psychology and the events that happen to you, but all of them combined really contribute to depression and anxiety. Most often when symptoms are really severe, people go to see their doctors and they ask them what's wrong with them physically. And so biologically speaking or physically speaking, we're talking about things like your gender or your sex, your physical health. Certainly if you have other medical problems, that affects your brain and leads to depression and anxiety as well. A lot of times we talk about neurochemistry as well, a fancy term of like neurotransmitters, and also how our brain responds to stresses, or what we call stress reactivity. In addition to talking about the brain and how it responds to stress, we talk about our DNA, our genetic variability, our genes, and how they express proteins in response to stresses. And go ahead, click forward. The main model that we nowadays have about depression is that it's about our brains, it's about our frontal lobes. Specifically, it's called low frontal lobe activation, that the frontal part of our brain has less activity, either electrically speaking, or it has less glucose metabolism, less oxygen consumption. In fact, since the 1990s, we've had an explosion of a lot of imaging studies. You may have heard of things like PET scans or CAT scans or functional MRIs. And all those technologies have been great because it's been helpful to help destigmatize mental health, moving it from explaining it from a stigma or emotional weakness to a medical model. And so since the 1990s, we've had an explosion of all these imaging studies that demonstrate that the frontal lobe has less activity. And I'll show you a study in a couple slides demonstrating that idea. Really, 99% of the studies have shown that in severely depressed people that the frontal lobe really has lower activities. If your frontal lobe, though, has less activity, then what happens is that the neurochemicals or the neurotransmitters that are released are usually too much at times or too little at other times. And so you have an imbalance of neurotransmitters. And so if your biology is not in a healthy balance, then what does that do? That affects our social circles. And you can see the arrow pointing to the social circles. We may have trouble concentrating or focusing at work or at school, or we might withdraw from relationships or sabotage relationships, or have get more snappy or irritable with relationships. And if our brain's not in a healthy balance, what does that do to our psychology? It changes the way we think, the things that we feel, we emote, the things that we think about. Depression affects the content of your thinking moving forward. Cato, next slide, please. And so when we talk about biology, these are some pictures of the brain, or at least cartoons of the brain. The brain on the left is a cartoon of the outer cortex or the outer coverings of the brain. Most people think it looks like a walnut or cauliflower or raisins. And you can see the wrinkles. And so the brain on the left is kind of the outer cortex. And everything that's shaded is considered the frontal lobe. The cartoon on the right is kind of a midline cut, as if you took a cut through your nose. And you can appreciate some of the architecture of the frontal lobes there as well. Please forward the slide, Cato. Now, I was mentioning that I was going to demonstrate or show a study that demonstrated this phenomenon that you have lower frontal lobe activation with different imaging studies. And I'm going to talk about an older technology called EEGs, or electroencephalograms. And what EEGs are is it's simply a way of measuring electrical activity in the brain. Neurologists will often use this to help determine whether you're at risk for seizures or if you are having a seizure. And go ahead, push forward, Cato. And you can take a look at, oftentimes, the EEG basically measures a voltage over time. And all these squiggly lines, the neurologist might be able to tell you if you're at risk for seizures. But there was a group of psychiatrists at UCLA in around 2007 that did a study with EEGs, and they did a lot of math where they were measuring that electrical activity and tried to map those nodes as correlated with different parts of the brain. And so you can take a look at this, that they had these models of the brain, and darker red represents more electrical activity. And all they did was they asked subjects to get into a state of happiness. And this is the average electrical activity of patients who were in a state of happiness. If you could take a look that on the left side, oh, maybe not yet. On the left side, it's a picture of the left cortex. And on the right side, that's kind of the right cortex. And you can notice that when you're in a state of happiness, that there's more electrical activity in that left frontal lobe. And that's kind of what I was mentioning earlier, that pretty much all studies will demonstrate that it's really the left frontal lobe, that if it's activated, it's generally in a more state of happiness. If it has problems waking up, then it's typically associated with severe depression. Now take a look at what happens is in the study where they asked them to go from a state of happiness to, say, sadness. And so they had these subjects go into a state of sadness. And in real time, what happens is that the electrical activity shifts. It changes. Something physiological, something physical happens. If you notice that there was less electrical activity predominantly in the left frontal lobe. They asked these subjects to go back to a state of happiness. Cato, can you forward it once? Again, that's what the happy brains look like under the EEG. And then they asked some subjects to go into a state of anger. And so you can take a look at what happens when you go from a state of happiness to anger. It's the same sort of general trend that the left frontal lobe quiets down. Finally, they asked subjects also to go from a state of happiness into one of the more common emotional states, anxiety or fear. And take a look at what happens when they measured the brains that are the most anxious and fearful. It's almost as if the whole cortex or frontal lobe really shuts down, save for a few areas. And so this is just one study that demonstrates a physical change, a physiological change in real time when people have changing emotional states. And so this naturally kind of segues into moving from the biological contributors of depression and anxiety to the psychological contributors. When we talk about psychology, we're really talking about behavior, our personality, the traits that we have, the attitudes and beliefs that we have about the world, especially our self-esteem, how we view ourselves, as well as how we relate with other people, our social skills, how we cope with stress, and our ability to learn new things as well as deal with our memory. In a nutshell, when we're talking about the psychological factors, if you can forward the slide once, Cato, we're really talking about the patterns of thinking that we have throughout our life cycle, the patterns of emotional responses that we have to life stressors, as well as the patterns of behaviors. How do we respond when we're under stress or we're under duress? And that's what we call our psychology. Can you forward the slide once, Cato? Thank you. And so when we have our psychology in a certain way, that affects our biology. It shapes our biology. As a matter of fact, as I just showed you the EEGs, that there was really, you can't distinguish between your biology and your psychology, because as you have different emotional states, that is your biology changing in action. Let me talk about a couple or three different metaphors. One way of looking at your psychology and your biology is it's much like a dirt pathway in a field. And so when you look at a dirt pathway, initially it can be small and few people see it, and so few people travel down it. But as people start going down that pathway, what happens is plants don't grow over it as much. You get more feet trampling potential plants, and the road gets more defined and grows and gets bigger. And so it really gets bigger with experience, the more that people go down that road. The next metaphor I wanted to provide is one of rivers and streams. Just like the road will grow the more often people travel down it. If there's more rain, there'll be more water that comes down a mountain or a hill, and the streams will turn into rivers. They'll get bigger the more it's used. Forward it one more, Cato. Thank you. Finally, I'm throwing up this picture of a muscle. Those are biceps and triceps. And one way of looking at our psychology is looking at our biology. Muscles, hopefully in everybody's everyday experience, they find that how do they grow? Well, they grow basically by exercise, right? People know that if they do some curls with with their biceps that over time the muscles grow. They physically get bigger. Why do they get bigger? Well, that's kind of what muscle cells do. They're living tissue. They have a biology behind it. They have DNA that upregulates when it's being used. It has DNA that upregulates proteins when there's micro tears that occur with exercise. And so some people used to call it magic, but it's really physiology. It's the biology where the muscles, the more they're being used, just like the river analogy, just like the road analogy, the more often you use the muscles, the bigger those muscles get. They build bulk. Also, the neurons that innervate those muscles grow and they get bigger. Cato, can you forward it further? Yeah, and so this leads us to this slide where there's pictures of a neuron. And the picture of the neuron is the bottom left corner. And you can see that when you look at a neuron, which is a brain cell, that's what brain cells look like under a microscope. And you can see that there's these arms or little cobweb things. They're called dendrites. Now, dendrites is Greek for the word tree-like, because under a microscope, it really does look like the roots of a tree or the branches of a tree. And just like in our muscle metaphor or muscle analogy, the more that the neurons get used or get fired, that these dendrites, they branch out. They get larger, just like a river or a stream would get larger or a pathway would get larger the more it's traveled down. And these neurons, we have billions and billions of neurons in our brains. And with use, these dendrites grow and they reach out. You know, if you think about how many neighbors you have, can you move backwards, Cato? If you think about how many neighbors you have, you think about, you might have 1 or 2 people on your street. If you're in a cul-de-sac, you might have 4 or 5 neighbors. If you live in an apartment complex, you might have hundreds of neighbors. However, if these neurons actually can have up to 10,000 different neighbors, believe it or not, that they can hook up or associate and connect, that these dendrites reach out and they can have up to 10,000 different neighbors. You can imagine the power of neurons that they can make, not just these computer bits that have a 0 or a 1 or a positive or a negative charge. Certainly computers are very powerful and is another analogy of the power of a bit, but these neurons can connect up to 10,000 neighbors. And so there is a lot of power behind these neurons. And as you can see, I've compared them to trees. Because if you imagine that the branches and the dendrites of a neuron grow in response to use, neurons also, they shrink in response to disuse. If you don't use it, that over time, these dendrites shrink away, and because they're not being used. And again, this, just like the muscle, this is living tissue. Maybe about 50 to 100 years ago, neuroanatomists were studying the brain, and they found out that when brain cells die, that they don't grow back. And so that made a lot of people pretty worried and very careful about their heads, worrying about brain damage. And to an extent, that's true. I think there are a lot of brain cells that don't grow back. However, we found out that over the years that there are certain support cells that actually do grow back. They're called astrocytes, and they commonly grow back and support the remaining framework that exists. You know, a concept that probably followed the idea that once a brain cell dies, that's it. A concept that came up after that is called plasticity. It's kind of, when we call neurons plastic, we talk about the flexibility of neurons, or the ability of those neurons to respond to stresses and either grow or shrink in response to use or disuse. And so rather than thinking that if you get hit in the brain, that brain cells are dying, a way to reframe the resilience of the brain is that it has plasticity, that even if numerous brain cells die, you have the power of these roots or these dendrites reaching out and growing. And in fact, when you look at the picture of that tree, you can think about in the Pacific Northwest, for those of you who are here in Seattle, many times we have all these firs and cedars that grow really large and big. The only way that these trees really grow that large and big is if there is other trees that die off, so that the root structure can take root, so that the foliage can come out and form that pattern. You can think of the biggest trees that are around you. That's a single tree that's grown from 50 to 100 years ago, and thousands of other seedlings had to pass away in order for this pattern to emerge. And that's really the power of a single neuron or groups of neurons. You know, part of the magic of these neurons is that there is a lot of cell death that occurs naturally when you were in your third trimester in your mother's womb. Also, you have a lot of death that occurs even upwards of 2 years old. You have billions of neurons that die off, and that's a natural phenomenon. In fact, that's the only way we learn to differentiate faces and learn words, is if we have neural death that occurs when you're really young. And this beautiful pattern under a microscope emerges with all the dendrites coming out. So hopefully most of you are still following me. I've talked a lot about biology, even during the psychology section, but it's really about these neurons forming a pattern related to our feelings with happiness, anger, sadness, or fear, as demonstrated in that study. Cato, can you move it forward now? So we've talked about the psychology and how that really affects our biology. It can also affect the social circles that we have. In a similar way, if your brain's not in a healthy pattern, go ahead forward it once, Cato, you can see the arrow, that psychologically, if you have poor self-esteem, then you're more likely to isolate. You're more likely to pull away from the supports in your life. Also, if psychologically you're more irritable, that might make it harder to do well at work or at school or at concentration. And that has a direct impact on the environment that you're exposed to. And which kind of moves us to the third part of our talk, which will be the social contributors or causes of depression and anxiety. This circle is also just as important as the first two. You know, inside it, we think about, well, what schools have we been exposed to? What kind of education that we've had? Growing up, who are our social support networks? Or the quality of our peer relationships, not just the quantity of it, but the quality, whether or not these are healthy relationships or not so healthy relationships. Also, our socioeconomic status plays a big role. You know, certainly money and finances plays a role, but is not what makes people happy, period. Certainly it's a factor, and you know, I think Malcolm Gladwell cited a study before years ago where he said the ideal amount of happiness was when the average income was $77,000 a year. And so it's important to take a look at these social causes or contributors to depression and anxiety. Can you forward it, Cato? And so oftentimes when we talk about the social causes, we're talking about that lead to depression is whether or not there's been a recent loss, a death. You know, certainly in this pandemic, where we've had a lot of losses and death, you know, the grief might be compounded. Not being able to attend funerals or be with loved ones. Certainly in this pandemic, difficult relationships might be magnified. Certainly separation or divorce or breakups are causes or risk factors for depression and anxiety. I've already talked a little bit about finances, but certainly a change in your job situation, the stock market crashing, real estate prices crashing, or just struggling to pay college loans. Those are contributors, as well as any other stressful changes. A real big question might be, does the environment affect our biology? Cato, can you forward it once? I went to UC Berkeley in California, and I was taught by a prominent neuroanatomist, Dr. Marion Diamond. She passed away last year, but she actually wrote some books. She created this book back here called The Human Brain Coloring Book. And certainly she was known for loving neuroanatomy and showing, bringing brains to lecture halls and showing it. And one of the things that she taught me is in one of her studies, she wanted to study the brain and how that responds to different social environments. And so she was part of studies, I think in the 1980s or 70s, where they took rats and they used the rat model because rats are very social mammals. They do well when they're in a litter of 6 to 8. They don't do so well when they're living in isolation. They also do well when they have multiple things to play with, like exercise wheels and scents and furs and different types of stimulation. And so what they did is they took a look at these rats and they put some in an enriched environment where they had other rats and other activities. And they also put other rats in isolation. Can you forward it, Cato? And what they did is the rats that were in an enriched environment, after about 4 to 10 weeks, they took a look at their brain cells. And you can see that in the enriched environment, the rats had a lot thicker dendrites. That is that term again, the plasticity of these neurons coming out and growing, just like a healthy muscle. A muscle would grow if there's a lot of stimulation. And you can see on the left that in the deprived environment, that these neurons kind of look like an unhealthy plant, a plant that looks like it needs some water or sunlight or fertilizer. And so I'm bringing this up because it's really about, does our social environment affect our brain? My belief is that it does, right? And if you've had the unfortunate history of growing up in a household where there was a lot of emotional invalidation, or if there was a lot of physical abuse or sexual abuse, all too common, and not really talked about enough, as we found out with the Me Too movement recently over the last several years, that this is a common problem that too few people talk about. And if we are constantly in a situation where our social environment leads to our biology or our brains not being in a healthy state, that certainly also affects our psychology, right? If you see at the bottom, I've put down this statement: chronic social stressors leading to learned helplessness. Helplessness is one of the core things leading to depression. Another word for it or synonym for it is hopelessness, right? And that's defined in the definition of depression. There's that feeling of hopelessness. And you feel that way because if you've grown up in physical abuse, you learn that nothing you do ever matters, right? You can do well in school, you can do your chores, and yet if you still get yelled at or you still get hit, you learn that you have no control of your situation. You learn that whatever you do leads to the same outcome. You know, soldiers experience this. You know, I had experience in Afghanistan as a military psychiatrist, and in all the wars prior to this. It describes this phenomenon of shell shock or conversion disorder, desert storm syndrome, TBI nowadays. But the impact of a war is that you have very little control. And if you have an environment where death can come at any time, you learn to feel helpless. Right? Many of my patients often will bring up this idea that, Dr. Sai, I have reasons that I truly am helpless or hopeless. But I tell them to think of it in a different way, not whether or not it's factual whether they're helpless or not, but what is the consequence of believing that you're helpless? You know, it leads to, maybe go back a little bit, Cato, not yet. But one of the consequences of learning that you're helpless is that it leads to another phenomenon called a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is kind of well known in psychological circles, where what you believe comes to fruition, comes to pass. One way of looking at it, and it's really powerful and very subtle, even though some people might not say, that's not really that strong. Well, one study that they did with elementary school children was that they had a class of elementary school children, and they identified about half the class as low achievers, and then the other half of the class as high achievers. And then they asked these children to take a test, and they had the low achievers and the high achievers both do the test, and afterwards, guess what happened? Well, those that were identified as high achievers, they did well on the test. And then those that were identified as low achievers, they didn't do well. They said, well, what's wrong with that? They were identified as low achievers, so they scored low. They were identified as high achievers, and they scored high. Well, the kids were tricked. And the reason they were tricked is because they assigned the high achievers and low achievers at random. So they just made it up. They told the kids that they would do well, and therefore they did. And they also told the low achievers they wouldn't do well, and so they didn't do so well. And so this self-fulfilling prophecy is so pervasive and subtle, and plays a huge role in depression, right? Oftentimes, one of the things that we're fighting is an over-identification with a label, right? When people identify as ADHD, they get the message, I can't concentrate. They have been diagnosed with depression. They said, I'm always depressed. Or they get labeled with anxiety. They learn to say, well, I'm always anxious. In fact, the message they should be getting is they need more of the coping skills and the treatments to overcome the concentration deficits, to more skills and treatments to overcome the depression as well as the anxiety. And so this over-identification with a label gets in our way often, and gets in our psychology gets in the way, where we over-identify with our label or have that self-fulfilling prophecy. Cato, can you move it forward again? So hopefully these three circles aren't made to confuse you or overwhelm you. Part of it is to have a broader view of depression and anxiety, that it's not just a Zoloft or Prozac or these medications, because that's just one piece of the puzzle. You know, I often use another analogy of tables, right? How many legs do you need on a table in order for it to stand? At least 3, right? And so these 3 circles are really the 3 legs that are holding up your table, that when depression is severe, meds alone are not enough. Typically, therapy alone is not enough either, right? As well as if you're still in an abusive relationship, that it's not reasonable to think that one of these legs alone can cure depression or cure anxiety. And so we talk about biology a lot. As a psychiatrist, I talk about medication, certainly, that plays a role, and that's what people usually go to psychiatrists for. But we also talk about sleep, because that affects your brain physically. We talk about other health conditions like chronic pain, back pain, headaches, as well as your GI system, you know, and dealing with those health issues. Even heart disease has been associated with increased role of depression. And it's not just from the stress of having a health condition. And so that's why it's important to talk to your doctors and take care of your health and your sleep. And if needed, consider medications. Cato, can you forward it twice and show those two arrows? Because if you take care of your biology, then the psychology can follow. And as well as if you take care of your biology, then that can help you manage the stresses in your life. It can help you deal with school, if you're in school, help you deal with work, as well as navigate difficult relationships. In addition, this green circle is just as important. We talked about the self-fulfilling prophecy. We talked about the plasticity of neurons, which is really your biology in motion. If you get anything from this talk, that your psychology is your biology in motion, right? It would be silly to think that if you're trying to build muscle, we have a lot of young people that are working out a lot, and in order to really optimize their muscles, they go to stores like YMCA or just buy a lot of protein supplements or creatine powder. And that's really things you put biologically into your body in order to help build mass. Can you imagine what would happen though if these people who wanted to build muscle just consumed the protein and the creatine and didn't work out? It would be kind of silly because they would just develop fat. They would gain weight, but they wouldn't develop the muscle. It's really the combination, the muscles in action with a healthy workout plan, with you know, getting it into a state of healthy exercise and resting in between. And that's what your psychology really is, right? In order to benefit from treatments, it's important to combine, you know, if you're using medications, but combining it with psychotherapies. And in the green areas, we usually talk about treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is huge in terms of adjusting the way we see the world, reframing a lot of the bad things or the negative things that we tell ourselves. And in fact, the journals really play this out, that when we compare psychotherapies like cognitive behavioral therapy compared to medications, that in fact that we pretty much have equal types of responses from both of them. And then after a year, some studies show that cognitive behavioral therapy actually have better outcomes than using meds like Prozac. And so again, I spent a lot of time also talking about the role of this leg of your psychology, focusing on cognitive behavioral therapy. Can you forward that, Cato, once? And so it is important to note that the green arrow not only affects your biology, but it also affects the social causes of depression. Because what can happen often is that if you feel that you're easily embarrassed or that people are judging you, that's what leads to avoidance of social situations. You might get so anxious that you don't show up to school anymore, or you start isolating, as I mentioned. Finally, this third circle is just as important in review, that it depends on, there's so much that's really important about your work situation. If you are in a toxic work environment, it's almost impossible to climb out of depression. If you are in an abusive relationship, that if your partner is hitting you or harming you or manipulating you or emotionally abusing you, it's almost impossible to climb out of depression unless you deal with that social situation. So many people deal with trauma as well, and it's important to understand what things are re-triggering those thoughts, those re-experiencing thoughts of PTSD. A great analogy I use, I think I learned from my mentor, Dr. Diamond, was if you are a plant, and you can have all the biology, the genes to be the best plant ever, but if you're in a pot that has no nutrients, or if you're in a pot that has no water, or you're in a space where there's no sunlight, then all of that biology, it won't go to anything. You need the environment to interact with your biology, with your psychology, in order to be in a mentally healthy space. And so rather than looking at a single cause of depression or anxiety, I've talked about a lot about different aspects of the biology, about the psychology and the social causes of depression and anxiety. Rather than chasing for one single cause, we're really looking at, and if you can forward this, Cato, at all the contributors of depression and anxiety. And often I'll talk to people about breaking it down, right? Because one thing that's true in severe depression and anxiety is that feeling of, I feel so overwhelmed, that they can't manage anything. But by breaking it down into these 3 circles, and maybe kind of drawing 3 circles for yourself, maybe you can look at what you can do for your biology, what you can do with your psychology to maybe reframe your thinking, and in your social causes of depression and anxiety. And the simplest thing in that sphere for you is to learn to take a break. Learn to give your brain or mind a rest. Just like if you're running a race or playing a long game, a sport like football or basketball, you take breaks all the time. But in our society that puts productivity on a pedestal, it really is important to really turn to relaxation skills, doing meditation, using your PTO and vacation time, and avoiding the excessive overtime that we think is productive, but it's not. It is important to have this balance in your life, and I hope you learn to take care of yourself moving forward. Nate, do you have anything that you would like to talk about, or should we open it up to questions maybe?
Yes. Let me pull up some questions and see what might be good for you to answer. Thank you again for taking the time this evening to share with us. I definitely learned a few things along the way. So let's see. Questions. I'm sorry. There's a whole bunch of them, so I'm trying to scroll through which ones are the right ones to share. Here we go. So can one be predisposed to depression genetically? If your parent or parents had serious depression, are you more likely to experience depression?
Yeah, definitely. This is kind of more thinking about the biological contributors to depression. I mentioned our DNA is the protein expression. They've identified a lot of genes that contribute to depression. They even have panels of 8 to 10 that are associated with, schizophrenia. They have a similar panel with genes that are associated with the serotonin neurotransmitters that I'd referenced as dopamine neurotransmitters, as well as norepinephrine transmitters, as well as a lot of genes that might be present in the development of the brain. Really, it's our frontal lobe again. And so, yes, we know that there is a genetic heritability about depression. I can't think of the stats off the top of my head, but certainly the more first-degree relatives that you have, a parent, a sibling, or children, the more likely you are also to experience depression and anxiety. In fact, that's often a way to figure out what kind of medications might work, because if you have an SSRI or an antidepressant that works for a family member, oftentimes it's more likely to work for you. They even have some gene panels now that can look at liver enzymes that process a lot of the antidepressants, and maybe use that as a tool to kind of fine tune at what antidepressants you're more likely to do well with.
Great. That's so. Would you consider that like a strong relationship? The close. I mean, obviously, the closer it is to the person, in terms of a parent and a child, is that a pretty? Does that show up as a strong connection, or like scientifically, is that still a little bit?
It's a strong connection. Part of, certainly if we're looking at just the clinical diagnosis of major depression, again, I don't want to misquote statistics, but certainly, I think they've had twin studies also, and so, it's not 100% certainly even in the twin studies, because depression has multiple causes and contributors. So even when you have identical twins, it's not 100% both of them have depression or diagnosed, because you have the social causes as well as the psychology that contributes. But on the order of anywhere from 25 to 50%. I can't recall off the top of my head. And certainly part of what muddies it a lot is because even under depression and anxiety, you have a lot of what we call comorbidities. Oftentimes when people have alcohol use disorders or substance use disorders, when you look at it and kind of strip those down, those are often self-medicating for underlying major depression. When we have other types of addictions, like gambling addictions or bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, any mental health diagnosis that we have, we often see a lot of comorbidities with depression as well. And so certainly there's a lot of genetic heritability. Even with schizophrenia, we have a higher incidence of not just schizophrenia in relatives, but depression and anxiety and substance use as well.
Gotcha. Thank you. And for those, keep sending in your questions into the chat box, and we'll be reading those out loud for Dr. Sai to answer. The next one is a little bit back towards the front of your presentation in regards to the frontal lobe. The question is this activity mainly associated with the frontal lobe, or can it be seen predominantly in other parts of the brain as well? I'm not sure exactly what the activity they're referring to, but maybe that gives you enough context to speak to.
I talked earlier about those EEGs, or those electroencephalograms. It really is specific to your frontal lobe, especially your left frontal lobe, right up here, that's kind of above your eyeballs. The left frontal lobe is I think I mentioned 99% of imaging studies about severe depression really hone it down to the left frontal lobe. It's not your vision centers or hearing. That left frontal lobe is involved in planning and organizing and logical thinking. And when we're depressed, that really shuts down, right? I showed the EEG examples where the electrical activity in that area really had less red, had less activity with the sadness, with the anger, and really shut down when people are in a state of anxiety. In fact, that left frontal lobe, if you've heard of, there's a more intensive treatment called electroconvulsive therapy, which got a bad rap with a lot of the movies. I think there's a Jack Nicholson movie called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and more contemporarily, there's A Beautiful Mind that had Russell Crowe, and a lot of other media portrayals of ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. And what ECT does is it actually is a real treatment, and it is really effective for severe depression and indicated when there is real severe suicidality or even psychotic symptoms. And the ECT, it stimulates really the frontal lobes, both of them. But when there's too many side effects, because when you put electricity through your brain, it makes it harder to think and concentrate, and people have a lot of memory issues. So they target it to the left frontal lobe to help reduce the side effects. And it really is like jump starting your car. When you think about your car running on a battery, when the battery is low, it's not working. That's more or less physically what's happening. That you apply the right amount of electricity to really jumpstart those neurons so that they're kind of more awake. You know, even years ago, I don't think it really caught on, but a lot of people want to build up bigger muscles, right? And so I remember what was advertised was a electrostimulator that you can buy in order to get bigger abs, right? And I even had a friend who bought one of those, and he showed me that he put the electrical thing on his ab, and you could see that the muscles would contract, right? And does it work? I think it does, right, if you use it long enough. And similarly speaking, with the ECT, that's kind of what happens, that you are exposed usually 3 times a week, and anywhere from 6 to 12 sessions, or even some people do hundreds to really help manage their severe depression. And so that's just kind of another example of demonstrating that something physical is going on, right? And it's not this nebulous idea just because we still can't see what's in there. You know, hopefully in the near future, we'll really have more real-time technologies that really demonstrate kind of something physically changes when you have these strong emotional states. And again, left frontal lobe is very clear in the literature. Even when you exercise, it helps to stimulate all those things. Your left frontal lobe wakes up when you think about goals that you have for exercise, and so forth. So.
Awesome, great, thank you. The next one is really about the industry that you work in. So is there a shortage of psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health therapists qualified to treat children suffering from depression and anxiety?
Definitely there is a shortage. You know, I guess the next natural question is why? You know, certainly I tell people that mental health comes from a longer history of stigma. And so I think the stigma of being a patient, when there's so much stigma, fewer people open up and talk about it. And so there's less business. And so fewer bright young minds go into the field of psychiatry. And certainly I think because there's been a lot of movements, you know, I certainly would credit a lot of the imaging studies, but, you know, societies and cultures change. 100 years ago, when people had mental health issues, we might have had, well, we did have different explanations. Explanations that it was something that our ancestors did that led us to be in this state, or something we did that, or some karma that's occurring. Maybe 50 years ago, we would talk about emotional weakness, right? This macho that we don't show tears, we don't acknowledge sadness, that courage is to run in there and fight and show no emotions. And really, I think we're in an age where we're more enlightened, that we applaud courage. You know, I think it just happened, like there was a 4-star general in I think he's in the Army, that talked about how he struggled with mental health, and he wasn't afraid to go and seek help from a counselor, from a psychiatrist. And he talked about his story where they wanted to preserve his confidentiality, and they offered him, say, hey, you're of such high stature, we wouldn't want this to get out, we want to protect your confidentiality, you can come in the back door. And he said, like, no, if I had the flu or I was being tested for COVID, I would go through the front door, right, to let people know I need to get help. And he went through the front door of the mental health clinic, right? And so hoping that we could have more leaders and celebrities and politicians really talk about how it's important to change this dialogue that we have about stigma. And I think we've been successful, right? Because I think what's happened is, now that there's more demand and people wanting to talk about it, we've had a jump in people choosing psychiatry residencies. We had a jump in compensation so that you can attract bright young minds to really serve underserved areas. You know, certainly we have a lot of psychiatrists in California, in New York, and in a lot of more urban settings, but there is a dire need of mental health professionals in you know, the Native American nations, in rural areas where suicide is the highest, you know, where access to healthcare and supports are lacking. In Alaska, in Montana, there are huge disparities in rates of suicide. And so, yes, there is a shortage, and we're really trying to get the young people to really think about their mental health, maybe pursue careers as a social worker, as a licensed mental health counselor, as doctors in psychiatry and neurology, and so forth.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that insight. That is helpful. So in the example that you gave about rats, is there a way to know the impact of introverts versus extroverts? So for example, do extroverts need more of the social circle than introverts, or is it universal?
I think certainly, you know, what comes to mind is, you know, as psychiatrists, we have a cluster of biological diagnoses called personality disorders, right? And so when we think about personality, we talk about a certain set of traits and symptoms that are associated with clinical diagnoses. In popular psychology, maybe not clinical psychology, you know, I think the most common example is I forgot the name, but the introversion extroversion scale is one way of looking at things. You know, I don't, you know, use those terms when I'm talking clinically about people, because certainly introverts, extroverts might connote a sense of how many friends you have, or the quantity of friends, or your patterns. Really, I hone in on the quality of relationships, right? Because, and that can be, if you're introvert or extrovert, it's really about the quality of the relationships that, you know, if your relationship is full of invalidation or lacking respect or lack of follow through, that's kind of what can really affect our mental health. And so it's really when you're thinking about your social circles, you know, rather than, and I talked earlier about over-identifying with a diagnosis. Like, for example, when oftentimes when I'm trying to treat ADHD, what gets in the way is like, well, I just can't focus, and they stop at, well, I can't do that. They might use the medicine, or they might find other ways of compensating. And what happens in the school is they learn that, well, certainly we can make accommodations because we don't want people to fail out of school, right? Education is a pathway to more health, or to prevent mental health. But this idea of over-identifying with being an introvert, because in reality, there's times where we feel more social and to be able to engage in that connection. And there's times where we might pull away when we're more stressed or sleep deprived even. And so that's kind of how I kind of view things, rather than thinking you're an introvert or extrovert all the time, that really you can manifest qualities of either of those traits. There's a great article, I'm sorry, not article, on NPR, I think it's called Hidden Brain, where they talked about the Harry Potter movies. I don't know if I'm supposed to be talking about that, but I think that's a great example. I forgot his name, but it's called Hidden Brain on NPR, where he talked about like, oh, are you a Hufflepuff? Are you a Ravenclaw, a Gryffindor, or a Slytherin, right? And those are kind of four ways in their world of identifying, oh, you're all Slytherin, or you're all Gryffindor. And I think it's very insightful, and he's talking about the same idea, that even the main character in Harry Potter, as you can tell I'm a Harry Potter fan, he wasn't always a Gryffindor, right? There's debate whether he was also Slytherin. And a lot of fans would say, well, the other main character is Hermione. Isn't she a Ravenclaw? Why is she in Gryffindor? And why why isn't he in Hufflepuff? And so I think that's a great example of saying, like, well, Harry's supposed to be this way, but he's not always that way, right? And this kind of helps us adopt a growth mindset, right? That we're not all depressed all the time. That if we're antisocial doesn't mean we're always committing crimes, right? And the same way, if we're introverted, at times we might feel more introverted, we might act on it, or we might not act on our introversion, and maybe we'll take a risk and connect with other people, and people might identify that as extroversion. And so hopefully that's enough of a kind of a talk around that subject, that you look at your quality of your relationships and getting what you need in that human need of connecting with other people and taking breaks as well.
I appreciate the Harry Potter analogy. Brings that to life. You touched on it just briefly, but can you talk a little bit about how exercise fits into the models that you described and the role it could play?
Oh yes, thank you. I guess it's anonymous. But yes, you're right. There's not a good reason for me not including exercise, because exercise is an evidence-based treatment for depression, believe it or not. It has been studied a lot for mild and moderate depression. It's actually, you'll probably hear it from your primary care doctor. If you're feeling a little down or stressed, they'll tell you to exercise, and then maybe you'll remember it as, oh, I need to exercise because I'm obese or I have a heart disease. No, exercise is for your brain too. It's for depression, and it is the first treatment, or one of the first treatments that you should be doing to do that self-care. And you know, people will describe having that runner's high, right? You can imagine as you're running, you're in pain, you're in despair. And at some point, if you keep going through that pain and despair, you get this zen, this endorphins rush, where the part of your brain starts to soothe itself. It's in the brainstem, and so you have all these natural opioids, naturally kind of make you feel good about yourself. And that good or that high actually lasts 6 to 18 hours or several days. And so they talk about the prescription of exercise is 3 to 5 times a week. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Monday through Friday exercising, usually 30 to 60 minutes at a time. I usually say 30 to 50 minutes at a time. Getting your heart rate up. Usually you probably want to be in a range of 120 to 150 to get that light sweat. And you know, a lot of people who are older, they have arthritis, any type of exercise, any type of movement is going to help, but kind of getting that cardiovascular exercise is going to get you more of that endorphin effect and the antidepressant effect. They even compare just passive stretching and yoga helped with depression, but if you do rowing or cycling, you know, for 30 minutes, it improved depression a lot more. And so again, the exercise is not magic, it's physiological. It affects your brain, it helps jumpstart your brain, hopefully gives that electricity and those neurotransmitters more of a chance to be in a healthy balance. So thank you for calling me out on that. I should have plugged it sooner, because yes, everyone should exercise, not only for your heart, but for your brain.
Absolutely. So as you can see, the next question on the list is, what do you recommend to help an adolescent deal with anxiety or depression?
I see. Yeah. As a psychiatrist, sometimes we get a bad rap of saying we medicate everything. You know, I try as much as possible, just because of my psychology background, to really sell people on things like exercise, to sell people on evaluating their social circles, right? We talk about introversion or extroversion, but I'm really talking about not isolating, right? Having at least one healthy or several healthy connections. We talk about a healthy diet. There are certain diets that are associated with helping depression as well. Some studies talk about a modified Mediterranean diet, which really kind of focuses in on omega-3 fish oils, low on fatty red meat type of things. But certainly a lot of it is, recommending that people go to psychotherapy. Specifically cognitive behavioral therapies are great for anxiety disorders. Meditation-based cognitive therapies like mindfulness-based practices. You think about yoga, deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visual imagery, all are great at helping with anxiety. Cognitive behavioral therapy is also great at helping deal with depression. And then we also talk about those social causes of depression and anxiety, especially if kids are in the midst of a divorce. Or I'm sorry, not the kids, but their parents, which is unfortunately all too common. Really getting people in divorce support groups, getting the parents to learn how to fight fair and not use children as pawns as well, right? And really kind of encouraging the kids to combat that stigma of saying, hey, it's natural for kids to feel depressed or have different emotions when usually the two most important people in their life are now not getting along. And so certainly getting the word out there, changing the narrative about how depression is not a weakness, and even kind of flipping the tables on bullying, for example, right? Especially because that's also a common thing, because yes, when you're a victim of bullying, rates of depression, substance use, conduct disorders, anxiety disorders go up, but the bullies themselves are struggling almost indefinitely from depression or from a difficult anxiety or a difficult situation at home. And so kind of recognizing that the perpetrators as well as the victims are both suffering and struggling, and we need to really be above this bullies are bad and we need to protect and rescue the victims. The bullies need the most help. And so finding school systems and social supports, that's really where we really need to make sure that there's an infrastructure to really catch and me talking with numerous school psychologists, knowing that a lot of the technologies nowadays can screen, on Facebook and Twitter, who's at risk, so that we can really get the adults in there to intervene with certain language patterns.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think we have time for just one or two more. So the next one I think is really interesting. Is there evidence connecting depression to teens' use of marijuana, especially marijuana in today's world?
That's kind of a hot button topic because marijuana has been a Schedule I drug, meaning it's highly controlled and classified by the federal government as not, or by the DEA and the FDA as not having any medical uses. That there's been a dearth or a lack of studies that can demonstrate that its efficacy in mental health conditions, right? Certainly there's a handful of studies that might have studied in cancer use and chronic pain, seizures, as well as multiple sclerosis. In terms of mental health, I give my patients a handout of things that I've been able to glean from the literature. From a mental health standpoint, there hasn't been any known efficacy or treatments of marijuana that improve depression or anxiety. In fact, it increases risks for psychosis. That's been demonstrated by, I think, a JAMA study that was pretty big, that was very clear that the rates of psychosis are 5 to 6 times higher, or it might be like 3 to 6 times higher for those who've been even exposed to moderate or low levels of marijuana. You know, I think not to get too much off track though, I think the question really focuses more on self-medication. The example of alcohol is huge, right? That often when you break down why do people drink alcohol, and it's typically to calm themselves, to help them get to sleep, to shut down their minds, to help them forget. And really when kind of, you know, I talk to people who about their alcohol use, having that idea that it's a way of self-medicating, right? And they do work. Things like alcohol does work, but it only works for 4 to 6 hours. And then it leads to withdrawal anxiety, and alcohol in the long run worsens depression and is involved in 50% of suicides. And so we talk about, and that's more clear for a lot of people, the dangers of alcohol on depression, on anxiety. I think marijuana, unfortunately, is in that same boat, that when we see a lot of marijuana usage, it seems like it is for self-medicating. You know, a lot of people will say, well, I just like using it recreationally. And a certain population might use it and not have severe health issues. But a good number of people do have a lot of mental health issues. I've already mentioned schizophrenia and psychosis. Anxiety is huge and big. And even if it may not, in your experience, you have it now, it could turn on someday in the near future, and often does in times of bigger life transitions, like moving, going to college, changes in relationships. That dynamic often can be enough where the marijuana potentially contributes to adverse outcomes. And so hopefully that kind of answers that question. One last thing I would say, especially with substance use, because most people, most adults will talk about, well, I use it, I can use it safely, that they say, but then most people will acknowledge, well, I wouldn't let my kids use it. And that's a little bit of intuition that is based on science and evidence base as well, because the brain doesn't fully develop actually until age 25. And so if there's deviations in that development, like an adverse childhood event, divorce, exposure to alcohol, large amounts of alcohol or continuous alcohol, exposure to marijuana or opioids or stimulants, that can affect the trajectory and the development. And so that's why I tell people, especially people under age 25, to even take extra care. Because if they're already presenting with symptoms, adding alcohol, marijuana to the mix might complicate it or make it more difficult to recover from depression and anxiety.
Great. So I think we are kind of running to the end of our time. Is there any last thoughts you want to share with those who have joined us this evening?
Oh boy. You know, there are so many books out there that really teach about depression and anxiety. And so encouraging your own self-reading, the cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, yoga, all those things, even the exercise that I almost forgot about earlier, really is part of self-care. Right? Even if you haven't been diagnosed with clinical depression or anxiety, everyone's at risk for it. I think, you know, I wrote a blog calling it the invisible mental health crisis during COVID that, you know, not enough people talk about it. And so one of my big passions is about destigmatizing it. And the only way you fight stigma is with education, right? And so if you look out there, type in cognitive behavioral therapy, really pick up a cognitive behavioral therapy book, practice some yoga, get on an exercise regimen, and ask a friend how they're doing with their mental health. And you'll find that it's more common than you think. I think 1 out of 6 people in America will or have developed a major depressive episode in their life. And for anxiety disorders, that's almost 1 in 3. Right? And so I tell people to look at the people in their class and their family. it's likely that 1/3 of your family members struggle with anxiety disorders, and in a given year, 1 in 5 people might struggle with depression. So share this video. I think I did put in a plug, I think earlier on, hopefully it's there, of a couple of videos that I did. If you still want to hear me talk more, there's a couple of videos off the Overlake website about the Overlake Q&A, COVID and mental health. And so if you want to see me talk more, check that out. Otherwise, spread the word.
Awesome. Dr. Sai, thank you so much for taking your time this evening to share this information. We had lots more questions that were in the box, and we're going to be saving those because the last session of the series is going to be a Q&A, so we're going to hopefully be able to respond to those questions at the end of our webinar series. So once again, thank you for everyone for being here this evening. Thank you, Dr. Sai, again for your time. For those who are interested in continuing to be a part of these or check these out, our next one is on Thursday. It's going to be a suicide prevention training. It's presented by Charlene Ray. So that's going to be the next one of those in our series. This has been recorded and will be posted on the YMCA of Greater Seattle's website. So you'll be able to rewatch it or share it from there. And if you're looking for more information or ways to support this type of work that the Y does, or in your community, you can also go to those addresses on the slide and get more information in those places. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Hopefully you've learned as much as I have, and I look forward to seeing everyone on Thursday. Have a great evening.